All right, hey guys, welcome to chapter 9. In this chapter, we are looking at adaptations and diversity. And in 9.1, which is this video, we're going to look at genetic diversity. Okay, so genetic diversity is referring to basically the variety of genes and alleles in a population, right? So these genes and alleles are then expressed as traits within the population. So genetic diversity relates really well with biodiversity. And when we talk about a population's gene pool, we are talking about the total collection of alleles that are present in that population. So the greater the gene pool, the greater the variation in the genes and the alleles. Now, it plays a really important role in the survival of populations and species, as we looked at in the previous chapter regarding some of the advantages of having diversity, and part of that is having genetic diversity. Another term you might hear is the allele frequency. So allele frequency refers to how frequent an allele would appear in a population. So higher allele frequency means it's more common to have that particular allele or that particular trait. And lower allele frequency means it's a bit of a rarer trait amongst the population. Now, when it comes to a population, there are a few sources of genetic diversity where it comes from. The first one is mutation, so that random development of a particular nucleotide or a set of nucleotides as a result of changes in the organism's DNA. That mutation, that is kind of how we can get new genetic diversity, new genes being formed. Crossover and recombination. So when the chromosomes exchange DNA during meiosis, that little exchange means you're going to get a slightly different variation for the sperm and the egg in the development of the gametes. Independent assortment. So independent assortment is referring to the alignment of chromosomes and the way that they are aligned and then sorted in metaphase during meiosis. So you can have different variations in the way that they are sorted on top of crossover and recombination. Both of these are already covered in when we looked at meiosis and the process of meiosis way back in whatever chapter that was in. We also have the random fusion of gametes at fertilization. So by the very fact that some sperm will connect with some eggs and not others gives you a slight variation. That's what makes you different from your siblings. So, one of these gametes and then one of these gametes instead. And then as a result of that random fusion of all the possibilities, then you get more diversity present in that population. And the last method is what we call gene flow. So you get an exchange of alleles between populations. So when an individual moves or migrates between populations, they will then introduce their genetics into that. So let's say you have a population of maroon or purple beetles moving into one with brown beetles, same species, slightly different diverse alleles, and then that will introduce that particular allele to that new population. Now, it's worth noting that of the 5 different ones, the only one that actually produces new genes, like completely new genes, is actually mutation. Whereas the rest of them actually just reshuffles the genes. Now, the importance of genetic diversity, basically having high genetic diversity means you have more opportunities or a basis for more adaptations, having traits that allow you to survive and adapt to the environment. So for example, crows being intelligent means, some crows are dumb, some crows are smart, and then the smarter ones are able to then adapt better to their environment, etc., etc. Having a healthy population, so allows having that variety means that the population can be healthy by being resistant to diseases. If you are a monoculture, often the disease can be quite rampant amongst the population. But if you have individuals that are resistant, then that can slow the spread and then they can pass on those genes and help the population survive better. Now that in turn will improve biological fitness. Biological fitness referring to the ability to survive and produce viable offspring. And also by having high genetic diversity, you also kind of accelerate evolution, meaning that the species are able to continue to change quite rapidly or relatively rapidly, and as a result adapt better if the environment is also rapidly changing. Okay, so that's genetic diversity. All right, we're going to take a look at evolution. So what is evolution and how does it play an important role in adaptations and organism survival? Evolution is a very central theory in a lot of branches of ecology and a lot of different types of macrobiology. Yeah, and so when we talk about evolution, it's important to kind of understand clearly what do we mean by definition of evolution. We're going to kind of address some of the stigma and some of the unknown attributes of evolution that we often don't understand. So when we talk about evolution, by definition, evolution is the change in heritable characteristics in organisms over generations. Yeah, and so when we think of evolution, we often think of this particular kind of picture where you kind of get the ape kind of turning into the man. It is better to kind of understand it from the perspective of descent with modification. That is not to say it is within the individual's lifetime, but we're talking about every generation having slight changes and over time being able to change that. Okay, evolution is a scientific theory, and it proposes that it is possible for organisms to make small alterations in their characteristics. These small changes are then passed on to the next generations, and with enough generations, you can have big changes and development of new species. Okay, so one thing to note is that when we talk about evolution, we're not talking about kind of immediate or within the organism's lifetime. So if you kind of think about Pokemon and how the Pokemon kind of transforms at level 16 and 36, that's not really a correct view of evolution. Organisms don't just transform within their lifetime, and that's not what we call evolution. That's kind of like metamorphosis, if you will. But evolution is really just over the generations. So a tree changing and its leaves and dropping them over autumn and winter is not what we talk about evolution. But when we're talking about, let's say for example, you having certain characteristics that are different from your parents, that's evolution, right, in its definition form, right? Now, worth probably noting when we are talking about a scientific theory that, just to remind you that a scientific theory is that explanation of an aspect of the natural world using the scientific method, which is different from the common use of the word theory, where we theorize and we, speculate something. It's not a guess, but rather it is evidence-based, and it is, kind of never really regarded as truth. Not even by the scientific community. It's consistent and it's proven, or supported by evidence, but it's never really 100% this is truth, right? And it's not infallible. In fact, when we often find better theories to explain something, we will throw out the theory that we thought was really good in favor of the better theory. It's like, for example, Newton's theory of gravity was really long-standing and really quite good for a while, but then along came Einstein's theory of relativity, kind of really bringing new light into what gravity really is, and that really explained a lot of things. So we threw out Newton's theory of gravity. Okay, now you'll see this appear a few times. This is what we call a phylogenetic tree, which represent changes undergone through species over time, and so. How you read it is that this is, we're talking about this is kind of like time frame, if you will. And as you go further along, when it splits off, that's what we call a branch. And that is to show that there was one population of an organism here. And then what happens is that one population might split into two populations. Like let's say one group moves over a mountain. Or some sort of other, usually some sort of barrier that they've overcome or separated with enough geographical distance. And then that branch then slowly changes to form a new type of species or a new type of group of organism or taxa. And then that can keep happening depending on how long we are talking about with the branches, right? So this is, for example, this is a phylogenetic tree of elephants. So for modern day elephants, we really only have two main species, the Asian elephant and the African elephant. But if you kind of go back far enough, you can see there's this kind of proto-elephant with a really short snout. And then you can see there a population breaks off, and then they might form more branches along the way. So each one representing a population split, and then where that split point is, or prior to that split point, we will call that common ancestry. So there's a population there, and then it breaks off again there, and there, right? So those are all your main branches, giving us the main types of, or the evolution of elephants. This is the evolution of humans, right? So you can see a bit more fragmented, but nonetheless, the first humans appearing somewhere between 6 to 4 million years ago. Actually, possibly could be even longer, depending on where our speculation really starts, or what constitutes a human. But really, Australopithecus was probably our first one down here. And you can see that the pattern of branching based on the fossil record. Now, where are we? We are the Homo sapiens, which is modern man or wise man. The word sapiens meaning wise. These are Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, sorry. And there is your first human, the Australopithecus. And that's kind of the first branch you can see breaking off from here and here. And there's a bit of a gap somewhere around here where we get Homo habilis, which is handyman. And then another branch somewhere down here where we get Homo erectus, the first upright man. And giving us kind of the branches that you can see resulting in modern man. In fact, it was kind of commonly speculated that modern humans, Homo sapiens, lived alongside Neanderthalensis and even Denisovans and so forth for a period of time. But I think probably it was kind of said that we kind of outcompeted them and resulted in their extinction, right? Here's another graph of the same thing. You can see there some gaps in the fossil record there, partial skull evidences as opposed to whole skulls, and it's a bit harder to definitively determine whether or not that's a clear human skull or not. But nonetheless, you can see the fossil record does support the fact that humans have changed over time, right? And pretty remarkable if you ask me. Okay, let's talk about the mechanism. So we understand that evolution is really just that change in heritable characteristics, and it happens on a small scale, which we call macroevolution, and it happens on a large scale, which we call more small scale is micro, large scale is macroevolution. But what is it that causes those change, right? Now, not all Christians debate that organisms can change over generations. We know that things can change over time, but we're really interested in kind of figuring out what is it that causes them to change, and is it possible to get whole species coming out as a result of that change? Okay. These are called mechanisms. So mechanisms for evolution are the drivers or the things that will cause an organism to change or a species to change. Now, it includes natural selection, which is the most popular and the most commonly known aspect of it. In fact, this is the one that Darwin proposed, evolution by natural selection. But we also have things like gene flow and genetic drift. So we explained gene flow already, that moving population, and we'll explain genetic drift later on in this video as well. Okay, we can't talk about evolution without talking about Charles Darwin. This is Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882. He was a naturalist, a geologist, and a biologist. And he coined the term natural selection in his book, The Origin of the Species, where he presented his theory of evolution, and in it said that all species of life descended over time from common ancestry. So he was the first to kind of link species together. They weren't just kind of distinct categories, but that they were actually formed or evolved from one form to another over a long period of time. Now, this happened because in 1831, Darwin set off on the HMS Beagle down to South America, and he studied the Galapagos Islands and a series of blackbirds or mockingbirds, which are today known as Darwin's finches, even though they weren't really finches. Okay. Now, what Darwin found on his trip was that he noticed that on the Galapagos Islands, all these birds had seemingly pretty much the exact same kind of traits all over in terms of behavior, pattern, and life, except for one thing about their beak size was different between these finches. And these islands, they're all quite close together, which prompted him to kind of speculate why was it, or theorize, why was it that these finches, whilst, living on different islands, have almost everything else the same except for their beaks, and and he kind of mapped out the beak size with things like their diets, and he found that there was a correlation to diet and beak shape and size. So certain types of finches, like your ground finches, they had these kind of larger beaks that were better suited towards breaking things up, like, seeds and nuts and things like that. And they had these kind of crushing bills. And then he found that, certain species that were, more designed to eat insects had more kind of insectivorous diets and had more kind of probing or grasping bills. And then, other ones still, were better suited towards fruit and so forth. And so that kind of contrast in the bill, shape and size, kind of helped him theorized that actually maybe there was some sort of common ancestry of the bird, of the finch, that kind of, as it migrated and found different food sources, adapted its bill to suit those food sources. Okay, yeah, pretty remarkable. At the time, he was mocked quite a lot by particularly the religious folks, because it kind of goes against what the Bible says about how God made this and God made that. But now widely regarded as a very central theory that we've got a lot of evidence to support evolution, and that it just makes a lot of sense. That organisms can change over time, and we've got to think of species not as distinct categories, but more as just a distinct point in their evolutionary timeline. Yeah. Another way that we actually also, kind of recognize Darwin is we give out these Darwin Awards, a bit of an internet gag, where we recognize individuals who supposedly contributed to human evolution by selecting themselves out of the gene pool by either dying or becoming sterilized by their own actions. So a bit of a gag as a way to honor folks who do dumb things, I suppose. And then they pay the price for it. So here are a bit more some tame examples of the Darwin Awards that are being handed out to people. Okay, let's talk about natural selection. So let's say you have a species of gray tree frogs here, and then you have a species of green tree frogs, and of the two species, both of them eat insects, live off the ground, lay eggs in pools of water, and are hunted by birds and snakes. It prompts us to kind of think, well, where did these two species come from, and why are there two particular species, right? So that's worth thinking about. If you have two of the exact same things, why is there a difference between these two species? And if you look at the range of these two species and the habitats, it starts to paint a bit of a clearer picture, right? So your gray tree frogs, they kind of live around here in America, and then the green tree frogs live here. But in terms of their environments, gray tree frogs are often found on moss-laden bark on trees, whereas green tree frogs are often found in reeds by wetlands and waterways, right? And if you take a look at that, it makes it a bit more obvious as to why there are these two particular species. And to understand how they came back, how they evolved to adapt to their environment, let's kind of rewind a little bit. Suppose you had a primitive tree frog, right? Not a gray or a green, but let's say just some sort of primitive, and there was a few different colors. You've got the green ones here, you got your really dark gray ones, maybe you got your lighter gray ones around here. And the primitive tree species exhibit some sort of genetic diversity, which is very important as a basis, right? You got different varieties there. And let's say a population of this primitive tree frog ended up in a wetland habitat, like just purely by migration or by movement across the landscape. They ended up in this wetland habitat where there's lots of green reeds and rushes, okay? What happens next is usually when an organism moves into an environment or lives in an environment, they encounter what we call selection pressure. Selection pressure could be anything varying from predation to perhaps maybe, mating opportunities or artificial things that are occurrence because of humans or whatever. But selection pressure, in this case, let's say it's predation, right? Let's say birds hunting frogs. And that pressure means that individuals with the right adaptations tend to survive better, right? So let's say, for example, in this example, living in amongst green reeds means that the green tree frogs are more likely to survive this selection pressure, and birds are able to pick off the gray ones, the light gray ones and the dark gray ones a lot easier. So that ability to pick out these gray tree frogs means that these green tree frogs are more likely to survive. If they are more likely to survive, then being green is going to be passed on as a trait over time. And then, these green tree frogs, they're going to reproduce, they're going to produce babies, and those babies are going to be green. And within the next generation, you get a change in their traits, all being green, because the gray ones are pretty much, they're all dead. They got eaten out, right? And so really, natural selection, that's what we refer to when we talk about Darwin's survival of the fittest, right? Being able to survive because you fit in. Not fitness as in like being buff or working out, but fitting into your environment, right? And that's what basically, in a nutshell, what Darwin was proposing in his theory of natural selection, evolution by natural selection, okay? Now, natural selection can occur in all sorts of ways. So as a whole, it is a process by which organisms better adapted to their environment are able to reproduce and pass those traits onto their offspring, right? So that happens over many, many generations. That change happens over a long period of time. So the giraffe example for this particular case, maybe the primitive giraffe common ancestor started out with a short neck, but as trees grew over time, maybe individuals with longer necks have a better opportunity to survive, pass on those traits for long necks onto their offspring, and it kind of just spirals and continues and escalates until eventually you have this particularly long neck in the giraffe that helps it survive better, right? So that's in a way an evolution by natural selection. Other examples, so for example, plants can also undergo natural selection. So, here is an orchid, and orchids are really known for attracting insect pollinators and then actually mimicking them as well. So this is actually a black wasp, and that's the orchid flower. And you can see the black wasp is actually fooled into thinking that the orchid flower looks like one of its own and starts to mate with it. So this guy's thinking he's got the time of his life mating with this other black wasp, but in actual fact, he's actually pollinating the orchid, and then he'll go to another female, or at least he thinks another female, and then mate with another orchid and then pass on that trait. So you can see that probably the likely outcome is that over time, flowers that look black and have a segmented kind of curvature on their flower shape might have attracted more wasps, and then they in turn produce plants and orchids that also exhibit that trait over time. Any sort of camouflages can also be attributed to natural selection. This is a katydid, and you can see the katydid's body looks remarkably like a leaf. So at some point, maybe, primitive ancestors of katydids that look like leaves are less likely to be eaten and pass on that trait. And then it just kind of continues and escalates. Yeah. This isn't a really cool example. This is an example of what we call mimicry, actually. So mimicry is when one organism mimics the attributes of another organism or trait. So this is the coral snake, right? And the coral snake is quite venomous and toxic, and predators know to stay away from the coral snake. Like birds and stuff don't really hunt coral snakes. But this is the scarlet king snake. Now the scarlet king snake is non-venomous, but it has actually adapted to mimic the coral snake. And so you can see there, the chances are that the coral snake's been around for a while, and then, this scarlet king snake, with the patterns that look a little bit like the coral snake, were left alone a little bit more by predators, and then they too will pass on this particular trait pattern, and then they get left alone. So looking like a venomous organism might actually be quite advantageous, and so that trait gets passed on. Behaviors such as instinct can also be selected by natural selection. So, the fact that animals will pack together in groups, like wolves, for example, that could be a natural selection. At some point in time, they were maybe solitary, but then the ones in North America might have started, siblings might have started to stick together over the course of their lifetime. And then as a result of that, they might have babies, and then those babies learn to stick together. And so that behavior gets selected for and passed on. Spiders, maybe certain, this particular shape might have caught more insects, and so that trait gets passed on. And this is really cool as well. This is called a blue bowerbird nest, and the blue bowerbird collects blue things. And you can see there, some of them are like, blue things like rose petals and whatever, but actually the majority of these ones here are actually plastic. So that's actually a recent selection where having blue items maybe were more attractive, more noticed by females, who would then come inspect the nest and then come to lay their eggs. And so that behavior of collecting blue things by the male was actually selected for. So pretty cool there. Now, the most unique of examples, or the most strongest case of examples, is actually in peppered moths. So here's a case study on natural selection and peppered moths of one of the most directly observable evidences for natural selection. So you've got the white-bodied peppered moth, and that's what it looks like. And its habitat range much of England, and it's light colored because it survives really well on the tree trunks of certain trees, right? And at some point in the 1848, they discovered the appearance of a melanic form, or a dark-colored moth, peppered moth, and same species essentially, but this appearance of this dark moth appeared first in Manchester, which is an industrial city. And then kind of this, kind of begs the question, why? Why did this subspecies all of a sudden appear with a very dark or melanic form? And really the reason for that, if you kind of think about the dark, they're not very good at camouflaging on the trunk of trees. However, during the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of soot that came out from the factories and that ended up covering the trees. So here is, the original tree, and you can see the camouflage much more effective on the light-colored body and opposed to the dark one. However, during the Industrial Revolution, the trees became a lot darker as a result, and then you can see this kind of bit of role reversal that occurs where camouflage was actually better if you were dark, right? And so if you plotted the samples that were collected, you can see a drastic rise in the population of the melanic form there over time in years. And then that coincided with the decline of the light-colored moths. So you can see that the dark-colored trait is actually being selected for by the environment. In this case, the environment being, soot-covered trees, and the selection pressure being predation. And, over the first generation, you might lose one or two because the trees were getting darker, and then the black peppered moth population survives, and then they will reproduce in the next population, so you can have more individuals, and then more of the light colored one die out, but then the dark ones survive better, and then eventually you will get a majority of dark colored ones as well. So that's natural selection occurring in your peppered moths. However, in response to air quality, you see over time, actually the air quality began to improve because since the Industrial Revolution, we got better at kind of cleaning up our factories, etc. And actually, you can now see the reverse occurring. The dark-colored moths population are actually declining since the 1950s after the Industrial Revolution and late into the 2000s. And then the light-colored form are actually back on the rise. So you can see this reversal occurring as a result of the smoke level going down, coinciding with the number of melanic moths going down as well, right? So that's natural selection. Pretty cool, if you ask me. All right, let's talk gene flow. So we mentioned gene flow earlier. Gene flow is when you have a transfer of genes from one population to another through migration, right? So usually migration involves overcoming some sort of geographic barrier, like a mountain, an ocean, or an island, etc. And what that does is that migration is going to introduce new genes into the population. Those new genes are going to increase genetic diversity of the population and can result in a change in those traits. So that population is actually evolving, not because there is some sort of aspect in the environment that is selecting for certain individuals to survive better and pass on their traits, but actually because there was migration occurring, and that migration is introducing new alleles, new genes, new traits, and those traits cause that population to slowly change. So for example, if you had a population of deer and then they cross into the mountain pass, then that population is going to then introduce those traits, like maybe the coat color of those traits mixing with the other population, resulting in a change. And as we know, evolution is just a change in heritable characteristic. Another example is actually, like caribou and reindeer are actually the same species, even though they have different names. In Europe, we call them reindeers, but then in North America, we actually call them caribou. Or actually in North America, we call caribou if they're wild and reindeer if they're domesticated. But pretty interesting, you can see that actually most likely they were the same species, but then the population actually migrated across that land bridge between Europe and North America, resulting in two subpopulations introducing into the genetics. And in fact, actually there's a story of a couple of reindeer that were actually introduced in I think it was Alaska or northern Canada, I can't remember exactly where, and then they actually mix with the local population, and you can see there they actually have different traits, but that mixing or that gene flow resulting in evolution. Now, gene flow can actually also remove genes from a population, which decreases genetic diversity. So it's not quite what we consider as evolution, but it can happen as well, because if the population leaves, it decreases the diversity there as well. Okay, this is here's another example of the evolution of I think this is yeast changing over time, and you can see there the two populations as one evolving and migrating with other populations and mixing their genes together as a result of that, right? Okay, genetic drift. So the last one we'll look at is what we call genetic drift. Genetic drift is actually really just random changes to allele frequencies due to chance events, and really is random, right? So there's no selection process, no reason why that particular trait has survived, but other than the fact that something random has happened in the environment and it has changed. And generally with genetic drift, as the name suggests, the further that it is left alone, that the further the trait is going to drift or change, right? And in general, genetic drift, that random aspect, that happens in every population, right? Just by pure chance. And the impact of it is fairly negligible for large populations, but the smaller the population, the bigger the impact is going to be, right? So for example, let's say, here is the genetic diversity of beetles living in like some sort of foliage in the ground. And let's say most of them are brown and then some of them are green, right? And by chance, let's say this population of beetles, or this very new population of beetles, 2 out of 3 of them die out as a result of people stepping on them on the pathway, right? Literally no other reason, by chance. It wasn't like people noticed the green ones were targeting the green ones at all. That would then become selection pressure, but purely because it was random and the person walking on it happened to kill more green ones than orange ones by chance. And then that green one can't mate, and so they're going to die out. And so actually this population is actually evolving purely by chance, not because of selection pressure or genetic drift or population movements, but purely because someone killed the green ones instead of the brown ones, right? And that can have a few effects. In large populations, it's pretty negligible because large populations then stabilizes over time. But if the population is really small, that's a really big deal, right? Losing 2 out of 3 means you can't reproduce, and then therefore the population of green traits are going to then die out. If it is small enough, it can occur, or it can cause what we call a bottleneck effect. Now, a bottleneck effect is when you have the parent population with all this diversity, but then something happens and then the population kind of crashes and only a few individuals survives. With the drastic reduction in the population, these few traits will be passed on to the next offspring, and then they will, form the next generation. And let's say, for example, in this case, these marbles, rather than you having, yellow, blue, and yellow, blue, and red marbles, only the yellow and the blue survive. And then this next generation only have yellow and blue marbles, and the red marbles have actually not made it because of this drastic reduction in the population due to some sort of chance event. And then we can see, as a result of the bottleneck effect, by chance, these traits are not entirely representative of what was really going on in the parent population prior to this event. So this event could actually be things like a bushfire, maybe it kills most of this particular trait by chance, or an earthquake, or a landslide, or a tsunami in the water, or something like that. And that reduction in genetic diversity means that the random assortment individuals are going to survive, but the allele frequencies are going to be completely different from what they were before the random event, right? And so, you might look at a current population and speculate, wow, these blue and these red marbles were really good at surviving this event, but it's not true. It's just because, by pure chance, the red ones died out as opposed to any of the other colors. And that's a pretty pronounced effect. So with that, your population size, that event's gonna crash the population, and one of two things can happen. If they reproduce, you're gonna recover, but you're never gonna be quite the same with these kind of changes in the next generation. Or if it's the population drop is so huge, individuals will never recover because of all these problems, and they will actually go extinct. Here's the cheetah and the bottleneck effect. So today's population of cheetahs have extremely low genetic diversity. That's because they've gone through 2 historical bottlenecks, one 100,000 years ago and another one about 10,000 years ago, right? The first one was because they expanded too rapidly, which is ironic because, they're the fastest land animals. And then the second one happened at the end of the Ice Age, which killed off most of the large animals. That, together with cheetahs low rate of reproductive success made it really hard for them to survive. It was believed that the lower populations, which is less than 7 individuals at one point, led to problems like inbreeding, decreased fitness, and survival. It's bad because it concentrates disadvantageous mutations in the individuals that, that have those traits, and it gets passed on. And scientists could identify it because you could graft the skin of one cheetah onto another and it doesn't get rejected, which shows you that they were closely related, or that their skull shapes in general, inbred cheetahs have kind of uneven skull shapes, and that was a bit of a problem. Okay. All right, so that's it for 9.1. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I will catch you guys in the next video.